In 1990, a class of 7th graders in Arlington, Massachusetts picked 14 stocks. Over the next 2 years, that portfolio gained 70%. The Standard & Poor's 500 gained 26, which means a group of 13-year-olds working from a school library and a stack of hand-drawn pictures outperformed 99% of every equity mutual fund in America. Their payment was a free breakfast and a movie. The man who noticed was Peter Lynch, then arguably the most successful investor alive. He had just walked away from the job, not been fired, not blown up. Walked away at 46 from the largest mutual fund in the world. Those two facts are the same fact. The argument he quit to make is that an investor's edge is not something you get, it's something you already have. And by the end of this, you will know exactly what a 13-year-old had that a Burberry-coated professional with a Quotron terminal did not. The decision arrived at a birthday party. Lynch turned 46, and 46 was the age his father had been when he died. That arithmetic does something to a person. He started counting other things. In the previous year, he had been to 3 operas and 0 football games. He had a wife and 3 daughters, and he could not have named most of his youngest daughter's friends. He wrote it up later as one of his own numbered principles: when the operas outnumber the football games 3-0, you know there is something wrong with your life. But this is more than a midlife story. He was not tired of stocks. He loved stocks. He had simply arrived at the point, in his words, where you decide whether to become a slave to your net worth or let what you have accumulated begin to serve you. So Fidelity made him offers, and the offers got harder to refuse. First, run a smaller fund. Less money, less pressure, keep the seat. He said no. Then came the one designed to be irresistible, a $2 billion closed-end fund with his name on the door. The Lynch Fund. 75 basis points a year on $2 billion is $15 million annually, more or less forever. And a closed-end fund cannot be redeemed, so he would never again face a wave of frightened sellers. He said no to that too, because it would still cost him his Saturdays. Understand what has just happened. The most successful stock picker of his generation has looked at $15 million a year and decided it is expensive. Everything he is about to teach you comes from a man who had already concluded money was not the point. Which brings us to the misconception that made him write the book at all. People kept calling him the Babe Ruth of investing. He hated it, not out of modesty, but because the comparison teaches the wrong lesson. If he is a big leaguer, then ordinary investors are little leaguers, and little leaguers belong in the stands. He argued the reverse with numbers. The National Association of Investors Corporation tracked roughly 10,000 local investment clubs, people meeting in kitchens and church basements, pooling $50 a month. In 1992, 69.4% of them beat the Standard & Poor's 500. Not 69% of professionals, 69% of amateurs, in a year when most professionals lost to that same index. So the question stops being whether the amateur can compete and becomes something far more uncomfortable. What is the amateur doing that the professional cannot do at all? Before the answer, Lynch wanted to name the crime. Around 90% of the nation's investment dollars sat in bonds, certificates of deposit, and money market accounts. Household stock ownership had fallen from 40% of families to 25%, then to 17%. A generation had quietly decided the market was a casino, and the safe move was to lend money rather than own things. So he ran the arithmetic. Over the previous 64 years, $100,000 in long-term government bonds became $1.6 million. The same $100,000 in the stocks of the Standard & Poor's 500 became $25.5 million. Same money, same 6 decades, a gap of nearly $24 million paid as a fee for feeling safe. He wrote it down as a second principle, and he was not being gentle. Gentlemen who prefer bonds don't know what they're missing. That sentence, gentlemen who prefer bonds, describes an Indian household almost better than an American one. Ask where the money of a careful Indian family sits, and the answer is a flat, gold in a locker, and a fixed deposit. The bank deposit Indian households treat as bedrock. The Reserve Bank of India's own household finance survey put roughly 77% of an average household's assets and property and about 11% in gold, against a low, single-digit share in financial products of any kind. Lynch was describing a country that had turned away from owning things. India largely never turned towards it. Same instinct, same fee for feeling safe, paid in a different currency 1 generation later. And then the claim, the whole book exists to defend. An ordinary person, no terminal, no research department, no MBA, who studies an industry they already understand can outperform 95% of the professionals who do this for a living. Not match, outperform. That is not flattery. It is a structural argument. The professional is measured every quarter against a benchmark. The professional cannot own more than 5% of a company. The professional must justify every holding to a committee that has already read the newspaper. The professional is fired for being unusual and early, and keeps their job for being conventional and wrong. You are subject to none of it. Nobody is grading you in June. Lynch put it one line more bluntly, and it is the line to hold on to. It isn't the head, but the stomach that determines the fate of the stock picker. So why did amateurs quit the game? Lynch watched it happen. Fund managers had been turned into celebrities, photographed in Burberry coats beside glowing Quotrons screens, and the pageant carried one message to the ordinary saver: leave this to us. We have equipment. Meanwhile, the scoreboard said the opposite. Roughly 75% of managed equity funds were failing to beat the averages they were paid to beat. The strangest part was who folded first: the high achiever, the doctor, the lawyer, the engineer. The person who has received an A at everything they have ever attempted quits soonest, because here they take an F, and an F is intolerable. So they hand the serious money to a professional and keep a small secret account at a discount broker for what they privately call their play money. And in that split, Lynch said, is where the damage really begins. Because here he did something a sales pitch never does. He argued against himself. Millions of Americans, he wrote, should not buy stocks. Not fewer stocks. None. He meant the people who treat it as a pastime. They will spend 3 months researching a vacation, comparing flights, reading about the hotel, and then put $10,000 into a company they heard about from a stranger on a train whose product they cannot describe. The worst thing you can do, he said, is invest in companies you know nothing about. Notice what that sentence quietly does. It removes the excuse. If the danger is ignorance rather than the market itself, then the market is not a casino and you are not a gambler. You are simply someone who has not done the homework yet. Which raises the obvious question: what does the homework look like for a person with a job and no research department? His answer was almost insultingly simple, and it came from a scrapbook. The 7th graders had illustrated every stock they owned. Walmart got a drawing of a store. Nike got a shoe. Pepsi got a bottle. Every company in that portfolio could be drawn by a child, because every child in that class could explain what the company actually did. Lynch made it his 3rd principle: never invest in any idea you can't illustrate with a crayon. Then he supplied the counterexample against himself. Dense-Pack Microsystems, a company he could not have drawn, whose product he could not have explained at a dinner table. The stock went from $16 to 25 cents. Who, he asked, could draw a picture of a dense-pack microsystem? Which is a joke, and also a complete philosophy. If you cannot draw it, you do not understand it. If you do not understand it, you will sell it at the bottom. So how did those kids do it? Not by luck, and not by a teacher picking for them. Joan Morrissey had taught at St. Agnes for 25 years. She split the class into teams of 4, gave each a theoretical $250,000, and let them name themselves: Rags to Riches, the Wizards of Wall Street, the Lynch Mob. Then she installed one rule, and that rule is the entire engine. Before a student could put a stock in the portfolio, they had to stand up and explain exactly what the company does. If they could not tell the class what service it provides or what products it makes, they were not allowed to buy it. Buying what you know about, she told them, is one of our themes. That gate, say what it does out loud to a room, is the piece Wall Street had quietly stopped enforcing on itself. And then the students did something that must have stung. A boy noticed a pen. Pintech International made colored pens and highlighters. The stock was around $5, and the company carried no long-term debt. The class mailed Peter Lynch one of the pens as a tip. He did nothing with it. He was managing $14 billion, and he let it slide. The stock went from 5 1/8 to 9 1/2. The master of the game had been handed a winner by a 7th grader and had not bothered to look. But the story the kids never forgot was older than any of them. In 1957, 88 residents of Salisbury, North Carolina, each put $100 into the local supermarket chain's offering. That company was Food Lion. $1,000 invested, then it became $14 million, and all 88 became millionaires. A grocery store in their own town that anyone could have walked into. There is an Indian version of that grocery store, and it is not hidden either. Walk through any large Indian town and you pass the same shelves those 7th graders were told to look at. The queue that never shortens outside D-Mart, India's no-frills discount supermarket chain. A wall being repainted with a brand every household can name. A wedding where the jewelry came from Tanishq, India's largest branded jeweler. None of that is a stock tip, and none of it replaces reading the accounts. Plenty of visible businesses are terrible investments. It is only the starting point Joan Morrissey gave a room of 12-year-olds. Begin with the thing you can see working, not the thing somebody telephoned you about. By the end of the year, Morrissey's students were reciting maxims into a cassette recorder, in unison, like a school song. You can lose money in a very short time, but it takes a long time to make money. Never fall in love with a stock. Always have an open mind. Just because a stock goes down doesn't mean it can't go lower. Adults pay consultants for that. These children chanted it. One holding did not come from a mall. A former student's brother, Major Robert Swisher, was writing to the class from Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, describing Scud missiles landing within a couple of miles of his camp. The class bought Raytheon, which gave these children a financial stake in the weapon protecting their pen pal. Afterward, Morrissey said the line that should have ended the argument permanently. "Wait until I tell the other teachers," she said, "that the kids' stocks have done better than ours." Because it was never really about children. It was about a method that does not require genius. Those 10,000 investment clubs ran on the same discipline. Meet monthly, study the company before you buy, and obey what they called the rule of 5. Never fewer than 5 stocks. Because of 5 growth companies, 3 perform roughly as expected, 1 disappoints, and 1 surprises you in a way that pays for everything else. Then Fidelity ran the numbers on plain monthly discipline. $1,000 put into the Standard & Poor's 500 in January 1940, and left alone became, 52 years later, $333,000. Add another 1,000 every January, $3.5 million. Add one more 1,000 every time the market fell 10%, which happened 31 times, and you finish with nearly $6 1/3 million. The declines everyone fears were the most profitable events in the table. So why doesn't everyone do that? Lynch had an answer, and every January he went and sat inside it. Barron's held a round table, 8 hours, a dozen famous investors, 13 spotlights, technicians crawling around the floor, 1 woman in knee pads, and an editor named Alan Abelson waiting to puncture anyone who got pompous. Lynch once said he still liked his ultimate savings and loan, Fannie Mae, and that it had a lot to go. "In which direction?" said Abelson. That was the tone. And year after year, this room of genuinely great investors would go around the table forecasting the economy. Lynch started keeping score of those forecasts, 6 years of them. The verdict became his 4th principle, and he aimed it squarely at himself and his colleagues. You can't see the future through a rearview mirror. The scorecard's worst chapter was the one nobody saw coming. Going into 1991, the news was a wall, recession, debt, banks failing, the Gulf War. Lynch describes barbers buying put options, ordinary people paying for the right to profit from a collapse. 5 panelists forecast a severe recession, and Lynch himself volunteered that the market could fall 33%. Then 1991 happened. The Standard & Poor's 500 rose about 30%. The Dow rose 25. Smaller stocks rose 60. It was the best year in 2 decades. Every expert in that room had been wrong in the same direction at the same time, and what punished them was not a bad stock. It was a correct-sounding opinion about the world. Which is why Lynch keeps returning to one sentence, and it is the most useful in the book. The key to making money in stocks is not to get scared out of them. Then he zoomed out, because a panic is easier to survive once you know its schedule. Over the previous 70 years, stocks returned about 11% a year. In that same stretch, there were 40 declines of 10% or more. 13 of those were declines of 33% or more. So a serious crash is not a freak event. It is roughly a once every 5 years event, and a 10% drop arrives about every other year. A decline in stocks, he wrote, is not a surprising event. It's a recurring event, as normal as frigid air in Minnesota. His diagnosis of the damage was blunt. What costs people money is not the crashes. It is the inherited memory of 1929, a trauma most investors never personally experienced, passed down like a family superstition, which sells at the bottom of every winter because it believes the cold is a catastrophe rather than a season. Lynch made this concrete with a real decision he was asked to make. A New England charity had a portfolio and a question. How much in stocks? How much in bonds? Income feels responsible. Growth feels reckless. Almost every household faces the same fork, and almost all of them lean toward income. So Fidelity's Bob Beckwith modeled 20 years from $10,000. All bonds produced $14,000 of income and returned your principal. A 50-50 split produced more income and left a portfolio worth about $22,000. All stocks produced nearly $14,000 in dividends and left a portfolio worth over $46,000. The all-stock portfolio paid you almost as much along the way and left you more than 3 times as much at the end. His verdict on paying a manager to buy bonds you could buy yourself became his 5th principle. There's no point paying Yo-Yo Ma to play a radio. But surely the professionals abroad are sharper? Lynch went and checked. He flew to Sweden to look at Volvo, one of the largest companies in the country, effectively a national institution. He found the country had, in effect, a single analyst covering it, and that analyst had never once visited the company. In France, he asked a company spokesman a direct question and got a stare. And in Japan, he found a market where a company could trade at something like 3,000 times its earnings. A valuation that only makes sense if you have stopped asking what a business earns and started asking what a certificate might fetch. The lesson is not that foreigners are foolish, it is far less comfortable. Expertise, everywhere, is thinner than it advertises. Somebody has to actually go and look at the company, and that somebody can be you. So where did Lynch's own method come from? From having nothing to lose. In 1977, he inherited Magellan. It was not a crown jewel. It was 2 failed funds welded together, holding about $18 million, carrying a $50 million tax loss carry forward from earlier disasters, and closed to new buyers. Nobody was watching. Nobody could add money. He was gloriously ignored. So he developed no strategy at all. He describes himself as a bloodhound. Pick up a scent, follow it, see where it goes. His wife Carolyn brought home a pair of legs pantyhose from the supermarket, which led him to Hanes. He heard the name Taco Bell and asked, apparently seriously, whether that was the Mexican telephone company, then flew out and ate the food. One warning survives from those years. His 7th principle: the extravagance of a corporate office is directly proportional to management's reluctance to reward shareholders. 2 road trips define the whole method, 1 triumph, 1 wound. Driving through Georgia, he made a 3-hour detour to Macon to eat at a restaurant chain nobody in Boston had heard of. The Catfish was good. The place was clean, cheap, and busy. He bought Cracker Barrel, and Cracker Barrel became a 50-bagger. In the same city, he walked into a store with concrete floors and lumber stacked to the ceiling. Home Depot. He bought it at the equivalent of 25 cents a share, held it about a year, and sold. It went to $65, a 260-bagger over 15 years. He printed the chart in the book and captioned it as a confession. Figure 4. One has caused me eternal remorse. That is the hinge of the whole story. Both stocks came from walking in the door. The difference between the 50-bagger and the disaster was not research, it was patience. And it kept happening, which is how he found the phrase that made him famous. Albertsons sold too early. Toys R Us sold too early. Federal Express bought at $5, sold at $10, congratulating himself, then watched it reach $70 within 2 years. He saw the pattern in his own behavior. When a stock rises, you feel smart, so you take the profit. When it falls, you feel loyal, so you add. Do that repeatedly, and you systematically dismantle your winners to finance your losers. He called it pulling out the flowers and watering the weeds, and said it was one of his favorite expressions, a phrase Warren Buffett once telephoned him to ask permission to use in a Berkshire annual report. So, the amateur's advantage sharpens again. Nobody makes you justify a boring holding at a quarterly meeting. Nobody applauds you for booking a small profit. You are allowed to let a flower grow. He also had a device, one question, asked at the end of every meeting. Fidelity ran a permanent lunch operation, bringing in a different company almost daily, and Lynch imposed a rule on himself. Check in on every industry he owned at least once a month. Then, at the end of each conversation, he asked the executive across the table, "Which of your competitors do you respect the most?" It is a devastating question, flattering to answer, almost impossible to answer strategically. Executives tell the truth. So Lynch collected an endless supply of tips from the only people qualified to give them, the ones losing customers to the company in question. That is how the banks got him. He had ignored regional banks for years. Dull, invisible, provincial. First, Atlanta had raised its earnings for 12 consecutive years while he wasn't looking. By the time it merged into Wachovia, it had become a 30-bagger. Inside Fidelity, the real innovation was cultural and almost petty. Lynch is emphatic. This was not a one-man show. Several of his assistants became fund managers themselves. And Fidelity did something unusual. It made fund managers do their own research. If you buy a stock, you visited the company, which means when it fails, there is no analyst to blame. Then the meetings. Analysts got 3 minutes to present an idea, timed by an egg timer that Lynch admits he quietly shaved toward 90 seconds. But the deeper rule was that criticism was not allowed. Not out of politeness, because the brain never forgets ridicule. Humiliate a colleague for a bad call in March and in October when their good stock wobbles. Some part of them sells $30 too early to avoid ever being laughed at again. They built a culture where being wrong was survivable. That is a competitive advantage disguised as manners, which set up the best day of his professional life. March 1982. Chrysler traded around $2 a share. The company was widely believed to be going out of business, and the American investor had decided the entire automobile industry was finished. Lynch went to Highland Park to see for himself and found something the story did not include. After selling its tank division to General Dynamics, the company held over $1 billion in cash. It could not go bankrupt in the near term. It had been given time. A 7-hour tour turned into 2 hours with Lee Iacocca, and in an engineering bay, he saw a prototype, a tall, boxy family vehicle built on a car chassis, the T-115, the minivan. That vehicle would sell more than 3 million units in 9 years. He called the day what it was, probably the most important day in my 21-year investment career. 8 months later, the obscurity ended in a single evening. Halloween 1982, Lynch appeared on Wall Street Week, introduced by Louis Rukeyser as the man at the top of the performance list, a 305% gain over 5 years. 8 million people were watching. Asked for his secret, he said he visits over 200 companies a year and reads 700 annual reports, then attempted a line about Thomas Edison and admitted, live, that he had never really understood how electricity works. America found this reassuring. The money came in like weather. A $100 million fund finished the year around $450 million. And that is where the game changes, because the man arguing that ordinary people should trust their own judgment has just become the professional they hand the money to instead. Everything after this is Lynch trying to win while carrying a crowd on his back. So he broke a rule everyone believed in. He stopped limiting how many stocks he owned. By the fall of 1983, Magellan held about 900. eventually 1,400. Critics called it a closet index fund. He said they had misread it. Roughly 700 of those 900 positions amounted to less than 10% of the fund. They were not bets. They were tickets, small holdings that bought him the right to keep receiving the company's reports and phone calls. Tune in later. He wrote it down as his 9th principle. Not all common stocks are equally common. And it paid in a way no screen could. He took a meeting with a small jewelry supplier, Jan Bell Marketing, that no other fund manager attended. From it, he learned who its customers were, the new warehouse clubs. That thread led him to Costco, which tripled. Nobody else was in the room. That was the entire edge. By the mid-'80s, the automobiles were the engine of the fund. Ford, Chrysler, Subaru, Volvo, 3 of them at one point, about 8% of Magellan. Chrysler turned into nearly a 50-bagger, and Ford multiplied 17 times, while General Motors, the giant everybody owned, merely tripled. Volvo, he got the hard way. On a 1985 European research trip, his luggage vanished, and he did the rounds of Swedish executives in a borrowed suit. What he found was this. Volvo's shares traded around $34, and the company held roughly $34 a share in cash. You were being handed the factories, the brand, and the dealer network for nothing. Also on that trip, an insurer, Scandia, that quadrupled in 18 months. And somewhere on a German autobahn at 120 miles an hour, he formulated his 10th principle. Never look back when you're driving on the autobahn. Then came the day that tested every word of it. October 1987. Lynch was fully invested, holding almost no cash, and playing golf in Ireland when the market fell apart. Investors panicked and pulled their money, which forced a grotesque inversion. He had to sell $689 million of stock into a crash against $1.3 billion of redemptions at the precise moment. Everything he wanted was finally cheap. The professional could not buy the bargain because the crowd was at the door. You could have. That is the asymmetry, and it is the whole book. The edge is not something you get from a professional, it is something you already have. And there he stood, unable to use it. When he added it up 13 years later, Fannie Mae, $500 million of profit from Magellan alone. Ford, $199 million. Philip Morris, $111. Volvo, $79. But a 13-year record is not built only on winners. It is built on how fast you admit a loser. His worst position ever was Texas Air, $33 million gone. First Executive took $24 million. Eastman Kodak, 13, IBM 10. The instructive one is Bank of New England. Lynch sold it at $40, then at $30, then at $20. He was finally out at $15, while the entire city of Boston told him he was mad, because everyone there knew someone at that bank, and everyone had an anecdote about how solid it really was. His tell was not sentiment, it was the bond market. The bank's own bonds were trading at levels that said default. Bond investors were pricing a funeral, while stock investors priced a recovery. Hence his 13th principle, never bet on a comeback while they're playing taps. Loyalty to a company is a virtue. Loyalty to a stock certificate is an expensive habit. By January 1992, something had changed, and it showed on his face. Lynch arrived at the Barron's roundtable as the most pessimistic person there, startling for the market's most famous bull. The reason was not the economy. He had stopped listening to the economy years earlier. It was a chart test. Take any company and draw 2 lines, the price of the stock and the earnings of the business. Over years, those lines want to travel together. When the price line runs far above the earnings line, something eventually gives, not because of a policy or a scandal, but because you are paying more and more for the same profits. He was looking at America's best-loved companies, and the price lines were high above the earnings lines. And he added, no software did this. A pile of software isn't worth much without the homework. Warren Buffett, he noted, doesn't use this stuff either. So where does an ordinary person find companies whose earnings are still ahead of their price? Lynch's answer was to go to the Burlington Mall with his family, $10,000 into each of 4 retailers in 1986, Home Depot, The Limited, The Gap, and Walmart, was worth over $500,000 by the end of 1991. Everyone was visible. You could stand in the store, count the queue, see whether the shelves were emptying, ask a clerk whether they were hiring. His 14th principle came out of that walk. If you like the store, chances are you'll love the stock. But the same mall was a museum of his mistakes. Toys R Us sold too soon, Chili's skipped entirely, and Ames, which drew the coldest sentence in the book, the lowest a stock can go, is 0. Seeing it is step 1. It is not the job. The clearest case of the method came from being outvoted at home. His daughter Annie liked to drink in a blue bottle called Clearly Canadian. He didn't act. It went from $3 to nearly $27, a 9-bagger in a year. His daughters wore green Chili's sweatshirts to bed. He passed on that too. So when all 3 of them walked him into a shop called the Body Shop, he finally paid attention. Anita Roddick had started at mixing potions to support herself and her children. It listed in 1984 at 5 pence a share. 6 years later, it was 362 pence, more than a 70-fold return. Lynch did the work anyway. He telephoned a franchisee, a former librarian named Kathy Stevenson, and counted the outlets, 92 in Canada, 70 in the whole United States. And he named the risk honestly, a price-to-earnings ratio of 42, a great deal of optimism to keep earning. Which raises the objection that stops most people buying anything good. It's already gone up too much. Lynch takes Walmart as the answer. It went public in 1970 with 38 stores. By 1980, it had 276, and the stock had risen nearly 20-fold. At that point, every sensible person concluded they had missed it. Over the next 11 years, it rose roughly 50-fold more. Because the number that mattered was never the share price. It was that Walmart, after a decade of triumph, was still in only about 15% of the country. The story wasn't over. Then the line that removes the last excuse. A stock doesn't care who owns it, and questions of greed are best resolved in church or in the psychiatrist's office, not in the retirement account. There is a second hunting ground, and it is the front page. Read backwards. In 1989, 1990, and 1991, the newspapers described a collapse in American housing. Doom. Negative equity. A generation locked out. Lynch went to the data and found the median house price had risen in every one of those 3 years. Both things were true. Expensive houses in expensive coastal markets were falling hard. The typical American house was quietly appreciating. And the reason the story ran the other way, he suggests, is that the editors writing it and the money managers reading it all own the expensive kind. That is not a conspiracy. It is a sampling error with a byline. So the instruction is unglamorous and very powerful. When a whole sector is being written off, go find the number underneath the adjective, because a business does not become worthless simply because it has become unfashionable. Sometimes the research costs you personally. Lynch was interested in a chain called Supercuts. It had gone public at $11, had over 650 stores, and ran a model he liked, haircuts at $8.95. Stylists paid $5 to $7 an hour who could cut nearly 3 heads an hour and generate around $30 an hour, with franchisees, not head office, funding the expansion. He also noticed something that amused him darkly. Haircutters are licensed by the state. Fund managers are not. But he had a regular barber, Vinny, whom he had gone to for years. Researching supercuts meant cheating on Vinny. He went anyway, sat down, and lost his sideburns. I felt, he wrote, like the privet hedge in the movie Edward Scissorhands, which produced the funniest exception to his own rule about liking the store. Here, he liked the stock considerably more than the haircut. Now, the doctrine that separates Lynch from every growth investor of his era. Given the choice, he would rather own a great company in a lousy industry than a good company in a great one. Because a hot industry attracts competitors, and competitors destroy returns. As he put it, in business, competition is never as healthy as total domination. Proof was an airline. In a decade, the airline industry became a graveyard. Southwest went from $2.40 to $24, and it did it by refusing things. No meals, no assigned seats, no fleet of aircraft types. Herb Kelleher was the sort of chief executive who fired a decorator and rehung the employee picnic photographs himself. delivered safety briefings as rap songs, and put staff in blue jeans. Everyone else was buying prestige. Southwest bought cost per seat mile. And when an industry stops trying, the one company still trying inherits all of it. The purest version of that came with an insult in print. Greentree Financial lent money against mobile homes, an unglamorous business in a shrinking market, with only about 200,000 new mobile homes sold in 1990. Forbes ran an article on the company under a headline asking whether the tree's roots were withering. The stock, already beaten down near $8, was being publicly buried. Over the next 9 months, it went to 36. And the reason was inside the very pessimism that produced the headline. The market was bad, so lenders had quit. Every competitor who left handed their customers to the survivor, and a shrinking market with one lender in it is more profitable than a growing market with 40. That is the inversion at the heart of this book. Bad news about an industry is often the best news you can get about the strongest company inside it. Which brings us to the most emotionally loaded sector in America at that moment: savings and loans. Once thrift meant Jimmy Stewart and It's a Wonderful Life, standing at a counter explaining that your money is in Joe's house. By 1993, it meant executives in handcuffs, a bailout costing hundreds of billions, and thousands of fraud investigations. Lynch sorted them into 3 species: the bad guys, outright criminals, one of whom turned $1 million of equity into $20 million of loans and spent it on private jets, and at one point imported elephants. The greedy guys, ordinary bankers who abandoned dull lending for glamorous commercial property because it made them feel important. And the Jimmy Stewarts, who kept taking deposits and writing mortgages the whole time. Here was the fact the headlines had buried. Over 100 of these institutions were financially stronger than J.P. Morgan. The scandal had priced the innocent and the guilty identically. His favorite of the Jimmy Stewarts was run by a married couple. Herbert and Marion Sandler ran Golden West with what Lynch describes as the equanimity of a 1950s television family and the shrewdness of Warren Buffett. He telephoned and got a black telephone answered with a single word: pickup. Their obsession was expenses. Lynch tells of a Sandler speech on expense control at an industry conference in West Virginia, from which roughly a third of the audience walked out, because being lectured on frugality is unbearable to people who have just discovered leverage. The ones who walked out are largely gone now. The couple who bored them survived. Which is Lynch's whole test for a lender, compressed into an anecdote. In a business where anyone can grow by lowering their standards, the only durable question is who refuses to. Excitement in a bank is not a feature, it is a warning. Then he found something in the thrift world that sounds impossible, so he explains it slowly. When a mutual savings bank converts and sells shares to the public, the money raised does not go to a founder or a venture fund. There is no owner to pay. The proceeds go into the institution's own vault. So a business worth, say, $10 a share sells shares and immediately holds something close to $20 a share of book value. The buyer's own money is delivered to the thing they just bought. The results were not subtle. Of 16 such offerings in 1991, the worst rose 87%, 4 tripled, and 1, Magna Bancorp, became a 10-bagger in 32 months. His instruction was almost comic. Find one that has not yet converted, open an account, and wait to be offered shares. Hold on to that one. It has a sting in its tail. Cyclical companies are where confident amateurs get destroyed because the rules run backwards. With a normal business, a low price-to-earnings ratio is a bargain. With a cyclical, it usually means the boom is ending and earnings are about to collapse, while a high ratio at the bottom is often the buy signal. Lynch worked Phelps Dodge, a copper producer, from the ground up. He asked his plumber what copper pipe was costing. He counted the smelters and found the world could not easily build more. Then the balance sheet. Equity of $1.68 billion against net debt of barely $300 million. It could survive a bad decade. Then the arithmetic. 1.1 billion pounds of copper against 70 million shares. So a 1 cent rise in the copper price was 10 cents a share of earnings. He applied identical logic to General Motors, a wreck with divisions strong enough to carry it. There is one more graveyard he liked, and it is the safest: electric utilities in disgrace. A utility that has ruined itself, usually on a nuclear plant, has a protection no other troubled business has. The state cannot let it die. A region needs its power. So regulators, however furious, have a vested interest in the company's survival, which produces an unusually legible cycle. Disaster, the write-off, the panic, the dividend canceled, then crisis management, cost cuts, lawyers, then financial stabilization, when it can at least fund itself, then recovery, and eventually the dividend comes back. Lynch's strategy was to buy at the moment of maximum humiliation, when the dividend is omitted, and hold until it is restored. He had watched CMS Energy fall from the 20s to $4.50 after exactly that omission, then rise to 36, ninefold in 5 years, for people who bought the funeral instead of attending it. He then found a source of bargains created deliberately by politics. When a government privatizes something, a telephone system, a water utility, a railway, the buyers are also voters. A government that prices the sale too high creates a nation of angry losers, and Britain had learned that the hard way on an earlier flotation. So, the deals were priced to succeed. British Telecom's offering was the largest the world had then seen, and 3 million Britons bought in. The water companies were monopolies whose debts had been absorbed before sale, sold partly paid, with a dividend calculated on the full price, around 20% in the first year to holders who had put down 40. In America, Conrail went from $10 to $46. Lynch's 21st principle is therefore the most cynical and most practical line in the book. Whatever the Queen is selling, buy it. And now the position that dwarfs everything else he ever did. Lynch recommended Fannie Mae at the Barron's roundtable 6 years running. Magellan alone made about $500 million on it. Across Fidelity's funds, over $1 billion. He believed the most money ever made by one fund group on one stock. It did not come from a flash of genius. It came from being told he was wrong for 8 consecutive years. His rule for the whole diary is worth writing on a wall. A company does not tell you to buy it. There is always something to worry about, and always respected investors saying you're wrong. You have to know the story better than they do, and have faith in what you know. By 1989, his conviction was total, and he used trading desk slang for what he did, backing up the truck, buying every share he was legally permitted to own. So what did he know that they didn't? He had watched the company change species. In the 70s, Fannie Mae did the most dangerous thing in finance. It borrowed short and lent long, holding 30-year mortgages funded by short-term money. When rates rose, it very nearly died. The shares fell from $9 to $2, and people openly discussed its extinction. Then David Maxwell arrived and rebuilt the machine. Instead of holding the mortgages, it packaged them and sold them on, taking a small fee on enormous volume, about 1% on $100 billion. It became a bank with almost no branches, 1,300 employees, no corporate excess, extraordinary margins. The old risk, the block of granite of long-held mortgages, was chipped away $10 billion at a time. And still Wall Street priced the company as though it were about to fail. That is the 8-year gap Lynch got paid to stand in. India ran its own version of that argument, and it also took decades. The idea that an ordinary salaried Indian would repay a home loan was, for a long time, not obvious at all. The received wisdom was that they would default, that the paperwork was impossible, that the market did not exist. The lenders who built that business had to keep believing their own numbers while being told they were wrong. The company matters less here than the shape. What Lynch describes is not an American phenomenon. That 8-year gap he got paid to stand in, the distance between what the numbers say and what everyone around you says, is what conviction costs, in every market, including yours. Now the sector everyone claims is impossible. Picture a man of 66 driving a battered Cadillac in a dark business suit rather than the white planter's outfit he would later be famous for, going door to door with a chicken recipe. A new superhighway had bypassed his restaurant and taken his livelihood with it. That was Colonel Harlan Sanders, starting over at an age when most people stop. Serious investors of the era laughed at restaurant stocks. Here's what they laughed at. Shawnee's became a 168 bagger. Bob Evans Farms, 83. Howard Johnson, $40. Kentucky Fried Chicken, $27.5. McDonald's, $400. $10,000 split across those five made you a millionaire twice over. All of it in McDonald's alone made you a millionaire 4 times over. And everyone could be judged by a customer standing at the counter years before it was fashionable. But restaurants also gave Lynch his cleanest lesson in how growth kills. Chili's and Fuddruckers were doing effectively the same thing in the same era. A better hamburger, table service, a young crowd. One prospered. The other joined the list of chains nobody remembers. The difference was speed. Chili's opened 30 to 35 new restaurants a year, and Lynch treats that restraint as the reason it survived. Slow enough that each site was chosen properly, each manager trained, each kitchen staffed. Fuddruckers raced past 100 openings a year. Above 100 new units annually, he says flatly, is the danger zone, because expansion at that pace outruns your ability to hire people who care. And he defends the sector while he criticizes it. A fish and chip chain in California has no effect on a restaurant in New York, and a diner never has to fear a cheaper imported competitor. Restaurants can fail. They cannot be invaded. Which leaves the question every investor eventually asks, when do I look again? Lynch's answer is a routine, not an instinct. Every 6 months, 2 questions per holding. Is the stock still attractively priced relative to earnings? And is anything happening in the business to make it grow faster? 3 verdicts follow. The story is better and you buy more, worse and you sell, or unchanged and you do nothing. He then applied it to his own recommendations and reported the results honestly, including the awkward part. His best performers were the savings and loans, and the best of those were the 2 riskiest, one up 70%, another 37%. But he refused to celebrate. He pointed out that the riskiest still had $55 million of commercial loans standing against $21 million of net worth, which meant it could still disappear entirely. Being right so far is not the same as being safe. And then the hardest discipline in the book, which he demonstrates rather than explains. Chrysler had already doubled. By every instinct of self-protection, you take that and go home. You have your win. You avoid looking foolish. You bank the story. Lynch put it back at the top of his list at $21, $22. His reasoning is brutally simple. Whether 1 million investors made money in that stock last month or lost money in it last month has no bearing whatsoever on what the business will earn next year. The past has no vote. Cash of $3.6 billion, debt of $3.7, and a product line people were queuing for, those had votes. He calls it the be here now approach, and it is the precise opposite of how a person sitting on a profit behaves. The stock does not know you own it. It also does not know what you paid. Now, the part most summaries leave out, and the reason to trust the rest of it. Lynch got things wrong, and in the book's final pages, he says so without softening it. He had fallen for the garden nursery businesses, General Host, Sunbelt, Callaway's. He liked the theme, he liked the stores, and he wanted the thesis to be true. My passion for the nursery companies, he wrote, was a big mistake. I deluded myself about the entire matter. He had underestimated the discount chains and simultaneously the stubborn survival of the local independents. Sunbelt, recommended at $6.25, was bought out at $5, an outcome he calls accurately a Pyrrhic victory. That is a man who has just spent 300 pages telling you to trust your own observations, publicly documenting the time his own observations were a fiction in disguise. Which is why the next confession matters more than the winners did. The Body Shop, his showcase, fell badly, from 362 pence to 263, and eventually to a low of 140. Adverse publicity had hit the company, and the market did what markets do with a crowded, expensive story. It left in a hurry. Now watch what Lynch does, because this is the method in one move. He does not defend the stock, and he does not abandon it out of embarrassment. He asks a single question. The important issue was not that Body Shop had fallen, but why it had fallen. He works through the sales, the store count, the growth rate, concludes the business is intact, and re-recommends it at less than half his own entry price. Anyone can buy a bargain. Very few can buy their own mistake at a discount in public, having already been proved wrong once. That is the stomach he keeps talking about. Then the book does something almost no investment book does. It undercuts its own best idea on the last page. Remember the mutual thrift conversion, the money that goes back into its own vault? Lynch pushed it right to the end. Over 1,000 mutual savings banks were left, and he suggested putting $1,000 into 50 of them and waiting to be offered shares. Then, immediately beneath it, a news flash. The Office of Thrift Supervision had imposed a moratorium on conversions because insiders had been quietly awarding themselves free stock. The loophole closed while the ink was drying. That is the honest frame for everything here. 1,993 arguments about 1993 companies, written by a man who was long, many of them. Fannie Mae, his greatest position, was taken over by the United States government 15 years later. Nothing in this book is a recommendation. The method is the inheritance. The tickets are all expired. So he compressed 13 years into 25 rules, his own version of the chorus those 7th graders recited into a cassette player. The first of them are about where your advantage comes from. Investing is fun, exciting, and dangerous if you don't do any work. Your investor's edge is not something you get from Wall Street experts. It's something you already have. You can outperform them by investing in industries you already understand. The market is dominated by a herd of professionals, and contrary to popular belief, that makes it easier for you. You can beat the market by ignoring the herd. Behind every stock is a company. Find out what it's doing. None of that is advice about the market. All of it is advice about attention. The next rules are about what you own and how honest you are willing to be about it. Over months, there may be no correlation between a company's success and its stock. In the long term, the correlation is 100%. Know what you own and why. Long shots almost always miss, and own no more companies than you can actually follow. Than the two that sound like cowardice and are not. If you can't find companies you think are attractive, put your money in the bank until you do. Cash is a legitimate position, not a failure of nerve. And never invest without understanding a company's finances. The biggest losses come from poor balance sheets, so check whether it is solvent before you risk anything on it. The middle rules are the ones nobody enjoys, because every one of them is a refusal. Avoid hot stocks in hot industries. Great companies in cold, no-growth industries are consistent big winners. With small companies, wait until they turn a profit. And in a troubled industry, buy the ones with staying power and wait for signs of revival. Buggy whips and radio tubes were troubled industries that never came back. Then the arithmetic that justifies all that waiting. Invest $1,000 and you can lose 1,000. Be patient and you might make 10,000 or 50. It only takes a handful of big winners to make a lifetime of investing worthwhile. Which is the one advantage no professional can copy, because it is not knowledge. It is time. And the last rules are not about companies at all. They are about you. A stock market decline is as routine as a January blizzard in Colorado. If you're prepared, it can't hurt you. It is a chance to pick up the bargains left by people fleeing the storm. Everyone has the brain power to make money in stocks. Not everyone has the stomach. If you'd sell everything in a panic, avoid stocks entirely. There is always something to worry about, so avoid weekend thinking. Sell because fundamentals have deteriorated, not because the sky is falling. Nobody can predict interest rates or the economy. Study 10 companies and you'll find one better than expected. Study 50 and you'll find 5. Study none. And buying stocks has the odds of a poker game played without looking at your cards. Time is on your side when you own good companies. Well-chosen stocks beat bonds. Poorly chosen ones lose to the mattress. Which returns us to a classroom in Arlington, Massachusetts, and the only question that ever mattered. Those students had no terminal and no research budget. What they had was a rule. Explain what a company does before you may own it, and the freedom to be laughed at because nobody graded their quarter. That is the whole difference. The professional in the Burberry coat knew more about almost everything and was permitted to act on almost none of it. Peter Lynch spent 13 years proving he could beat the market, then wrote a book explaining you never needed him. Your edge is not something you get. It is something you already have. So the next time you walk past a business that is quietly, obviously working, the queue out the door, the shelves emptying, remember that you are standing in someone else's research department. You just have to be willing to draw it with a crayon.